Hi, this is Michael Ray FitzGerald. I'm the author of Jacksonville and the Roots of Southern Rock. I'm not here today to talk about my book, however. I'm here to tell you about some of the experiences that I had moving here to Jacksonville in 1968 at the height of the burgeoning music boom. And it was some heady stuff, let me tell you about it.
What was the name of that song you were singing? Down in the west side of Jacksonville.
Well, my family moved to Jacksonville from Lemoore, California. We were a Navy family. In 1968, my father was stationed at NAS Jacksonville, and we moved to Orange Park. And there was more music in Jacksonville than I could even have imagined. There were a few bands in Lemoore, but I'd never seen anything like Jacksonville. There were half a dozen bands just in Orange Park area alone. And one of them was called the Daybreakers, and I sat behind the guitarist, Page Matherson, in homeroom. So I knew the guy, and they had a record on WAPE radio, which was a huge regional hit, and they were playing all over the Southeast, all of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina, making oodles of money. And so I knew a guy who was sort of making it big, and this was a big inspiration. What it did was it showed us aspiring musicians that this could actually be done. There were real flesh and blood people whom we knew that were actually doing this, and we wanted a piece of that. Walter Eaton of the Classics 4 told me he felt the same way. He was inspired in the same way by Johnny Tillotson. He watched him make it big. So he knew that this was possible. In fact, it was doable, and so it made him want to do it. And the guys in Leonard Skinner said the same thing about the Allman Brothers Band. They said, we watched him do it, and we knew it could work. I had a guitar when I came to Jacksonville, but it wasn't a very good guitar. It was this cheap Japanese thing my father brought back from one of his cruises in the Navy. And it had round wound strings, and the strings were about a quarter of an inch off the fretboard. It was really difficult to play. You couldn't play a guitar like that very well. And when I got here, you know, I just couldn't keep up. I was out of my league entirely. And so I talked my father into getting me a good guitar, because, you know, people would take you seriously if you had a good guitar. And plus, you could play better because they're a lot easier to play. And it was a vast improvement in my playing immediately. And I found out the trick was to play, to use Ernie Ball, super light gauge, double-aught-8 strings. That was the trick to string pulling and playing blues and rock. I heard there was a guitar player down the street from me. I was living in a trailer park with my grandmother, who wound up paying for this guitar. And I went to see him. His name was Paul Glass. He had long, stringy hair, kind of unkempt looking, had quit school, was laying around his parents' trailer, playing guitar all day long. Turns out he had been in a band with Jeff Carlisi, who went on to, you know, help form 38 Special. The name of his band with Carlisi was Doomsday Refreshment Committee, and Glass was the bass player. But he also was a great guitar player and really sang his ass off too. One of the most talented guys to ever emerge from Jacksonville, I think. And you know, all these Southern cats on guitar were just really, really serious, and they could really, really play. I took my guitar, my brand new SG, over to Paul Glass's trailer and knocked on his door. I never saw the guy before in my life. And I said, hey, I heard you play guitar, so do I. And he says, yeah, okay, let's see what you got there. Come on in. So he loved that guitar. He fondled it. He held it, you know, like it was a baby. And he goes, you don't deserve this guitar. Glass was not very well-mannered. He loved the guitar, and he said, I really want to borrow this guitar. Is that possible? I said, I'm not letting it out of my sight. He said, well, I'll tell you what. I'll bring you to my gigs with me so you can keep an eye on the guitar, and I'll introduce you to my friends, and who knows? Maybe you'll meet somebody, maybe you get a gig out of it yourself. And I learned a lot from hanging out with these guys. I got to meet Jeff and hang out with Jeff, and through him I met Leon Wilkeson and Donnie Van Zandt and Kevin Elson, who would go on to be a huge producer. So I got to meet a lot of people through Glass, and I learned a lot of guitar lore through Glass. So part of my guitar instruction was to go see Dickie Betts. Dickie Betts was Glass's guitar hero. One time we hitchhiked to a kind of rough part of town called Paxson, very blue-collar neighborhood, and it was not a good place to be walking through there with long hair. In those days, it was an invitation to get your ass kicked. And if a muscle car, came down the block, you need to duck. And my hair is about as long as it is now. It was no big deal. But, at the time, it was considered an anti-war statement. It was considered a declaration of war on society, really, on straight society. That's the way the rednecks looked at it. And they would give you an attitude adjustment if they got the opportunity. So we braved, this climate hitchhiked all the way to Woodstock Youth Center on Beaver Street in Paxson, in the heart of Paxson, in the industrial zone. And the Second Coming was playing that night as scheduled, but they had this guy sitting in with long blonde, strawberry blonde, stringy hair down in his face. You couldn't see who he was. He just had his nose poking out. He looked like Cousin It, and he played every solo, and we were so mad. We were so angry. Paul and I were screaming at him. We were heckling him. Who is this guy? Get this guy out of here. We paid to see Dickie. We paid money to see Dickie Betts, to hear Dickie Betts. Let Dickie play. Dickie can play circles around this guy. And I still maintain that was probably the case. And it turned out this guy was Duane Allman, and we were sitting there in March of 1969 heckling Duane Allman in Jacksonville. There was another band called 1% that wasn't very good, and all the Second Coming fans were really used to this high level of musicianship from Dickie Betts and Barry Oakley and the rest of them. 1% was kind of a joke to us. All the Second Coming fans, we looked down our noses at, not all of them, but a lot of us looked down our noses at the 1%, and we said they were 1% talent. But I happened to be at the Forest Inn. I started hanging out there. The Forest Inn was a place that used to be a hotel, I guess, and a lounge. I was there with some friend of mine, a couple of friends of mine, on a Friday night. One night we saw a group called Ugly Jelly Roll, which was Reese Winans, who had been with the Second Coming, but he wasn't invited to join the Allman Brothers Band because they already had Greg Allman on organ. And Gary Goddard was the bass player and the lead singer, and he's probably the greatest singer that ever came out of Jacksonville. The guy should have made it big. I happened to be in there another night and saw 1%. I didn't care much for them, really. They just weren't very good. The singer for 1% said, hey, listen, y'all, look here. We're thinking about changing the name of the group. We're thinking about changing the name of the group to Leonard Skinner. What y'all think about that? And of course, the room was full of Lehigh students that was there following. And everybody hooted and hollered, and the crowd went wild. I had gone to Orange Park High School. At the time, I was going to Central Adult High School, and I was with a couple other guys from Orange Park High, and we didn't have any idea who Leonard Skinner was. And so I leaned over to this hippie a couple of feet from me, and I said, "Who's Leonard Skinner?" And he said, "Oh, he's the PE coach at Lee who hassles them about their hair." So, okay, I get it. And it stuck. Who'd have thunk it? So Melissa Ross at Stereo 90, WJCT radio here, local NPR outlet. I was on her show one morning talking about this. And I told her I was there that night when Ronnie Van Zant announced the group was changing its name to Leonard Skinner. And she said, "Wow, did you have any inkling you were witnessing history?" And I'm like, "No, of course not, none." She said, "Did you have any idea the group was going to go on to be as big as they were?" And I said, "Not for 1 second." And she said, "Why?" And I didn't want to tell her the real reason. I told her, well, I was a Second Coming fan, and we kind of looked down our noses at 1%. But to give them credit where credit is due, you know, they worked insanely hard and they became a formidable act many years later. Richard Price from The Load, who lived here in Jacksonville, Richard said the 1% had opened for The Load and they were the worst band he'd ever heard in his life. Didn't know how to tune their guitars, couldn't sing in tune, couldn't play in time. They were god-awful. But as Richard said, they worked their asses off, rehearsed 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, and became a formidable act. In fact, you know, they got to where they could hold their own in a stadium with 80,000 people against The Who and the Rolling Stones. So more power to them. It just goes to show you they were right when they thought that they could outwork their competition, because that's what they did. A lot of people forget that this music came here from California as part of the LSD movement. The whole hippie movement was inspired by LSD. In fact, this music was even called acid rock at one time. And all of this involved, you know, anti-authoritarianism, long hair, funny clothes, expressing yourself, anti-materialism, and so forth. And rock music was the soundtrack to that lifestyle. There weren't very many long hairs when I got to Jacksonville, but all the long hairs, you know, were into this ideology and the music. All of them, including the boys from Lynyrd Skynyrd. In fact, I saw Lynyrd Skynyrd in early 1969 at a teen club called the Sugar Bowl, which is more formally known as the Twin Hills Civic Association. And I was tripping my brains out. In fact, it was the first time I'd ever done LSD, and I went there with several friends, and just as we were starting to get off on the acid, a fight broke out. Because, you know, Jacksonville was predominantly a redneck town at that time. And a fight broke out, and somebody got stabbed, and the cops came, and my friends and I all ran out of there just freaking out. It was not a good experience for your first LSD trip. Oh, speaking of Jeff Carlisi, he, like myself, was a Navy brat. His father was transferred here to Naval Air Station Jacksonville, and there were a lot of communities around the Navy base, Orange Park being one of them, and then Cedar Hills being another. And he lived in Cedar Hills along with several other Navy brats. For example, Billy Powell, whose father I believe was a pilot, and Leon Wilkeson, and I believe Kevin Elson's father was in the Navy also. Kevin Elson wound up being a sound man and a big name producer. Dave Lubeck also lived in the area and went to Forest High School. So there were a lot of Navy brats in the area who played guitar. And I think they had a big effect on what went on in Jacksonville in that period. We know that guitar playing was a respectable pastime, if not a profession. And the troubadour tradition was very powerful in the South. It was something akin to an itinerant preacher. So guitar was a powerful symbol. And but then there came this huge electric guitar fad in the early 60s, what with the groups like the Ventures and some others playing surf music, which was all based around electric guitar solos. And so the guitar took off as a fad, you know, kind of like a hula hoop or Barbie dolls for boys. And so all of us Navy kids all over the country, you know, were affected by this. Well, when we, this particular group, got to Jacksonville, not as a group, but randomly, you know, we found we could fit in with this guitar mentality in the South. But the Southerners were much more serious. And man, they could play. I mean, you had guys here like Auburn Burrell. And if you were going to come to Jacksonville with a guitar in your hand, it was like being a gunslinger in Dodge City. I mean, if you're going to come to Jacksonville with a guitar in your hand, you'd better know how to play that thing. back in the 60s, there was a definite antipathy between rednecks and hippies. Now, hippies had long hair and they were against the war. Rednecks had this greased back, slicked back pompadours, and we called them greasers. And they didn't do drugs, they drank, and they weren't peaceful. They actually liked to fight. They thought hippies were unpatriotic and filthy, and they thought we were somehow affiliated with Negroes, and that was not a good thing to them. In fact, we were worse than Negroes as far as they were concerned. We were traitors to our race, and we were also traitors to our country because we didn't support the war in Vietnam. So they were out to get us. And in 1969, the movie Easy Rider came out, and that really exacerbated this tension. Now, to us hippies, the word redneck didn't mean what it came to mean in the 80s. And it didn't mean what it had meant, classically or historically. It meant simply someone who liked to fight. So where did you put Ronnie Van Zant in this? He had long hair, but he liked to drink and he liked to fight. So he was what we called a redneck hippie, which to us was a dirty word, a dirty phrase. A redneck hippie was a fake hippie. It was a redneck pretending to be a hippie. It was a redneck who didn't buy into the peace and love philosophy, but only grew his hair long primarily to get some of that free love from them hippie chicks. Ronnie Van Zant we considered a redneck hippie. Actually, it turns out Dickie Betts was one also. He was a violent cat. He liked to drink and to fight too. Although he did write songs like People Can You Feel It, Love Is in the Air, but he was actually a violent guy who bullied his bandmates. Dickie Betts had been a bluegrass musician in his childhood, and he played mandolin, and he would adapt mandolin licks and phrases for the electric guitar, which was a Les Paul through a Marshall stack. So it was an odd thing hearing mandolin licks coming through a Marshall stack, but he did it. And I went to a Allman Brothers show in 1971. It was their return to Jacksonville. The band's return to Jacksonville after it had left for Macon. And they were doing Mountain Jam. And I remember a hippie chick standing next to me going, "Ew, it sounds like country music." And, there weren't that many attempts to integrate country music into rock at that time because I said the two camps were violently opposed. And I mean violently. But there had been some attempts, Graham Parson had been working on it, Larry Murray, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Chris Hillman, other people had been working on fusing country and rock, but that hadn't reached Jacksonville in 1970. I can talk about a little bit about 38 Special too and its formation because I knew Jeff Carlisi. I had met him through my friend in the trailer park who taught me guitar, Paul Glass. In 1970, I was invited to audition for a group called Sweet Rooster, with three of whose members would go on to form 38 Special. Another member was Kevin Elson, and I auditioned in his parents' garage at their house in Cedar Hills. And I flunked the audition. I wasn't really interested in what they were doing, and I guess I didn't show the appropriate amount of enthusiasm, of course. And they went on without me, and got to be a very big group, actually. They had more hits than any other band out of Jacksonville. They had something like 15 top 40 or top 100 hits, all told. I first saw them at a nightclub in Avondale called Mother Earth. It had been a grocery store, and It had been remodeled into a nightclub, and 38 played one of its early gigs there. It was the loudest band I'd ever heard in my life. It was excruciating. I mean, I had to cover my ears, and I'm a rock musician, and I like it loud. But they were absolutely, unquestionably, the loudest band I ever heard. And I remember complaining to Jeff about it at the time, but he seemed more amused than anything.